In April 1974, the Eurovision Song Contest was taking place in Brighton in England, but to say it was like any other would be a bit of a stretch. It was probably most famous for introducing ABBA to the world, but elsewhere the Italians didn't even broadcast their song. This is because it was called Sì, which of course means yes, and they believed that it could be portrayed as subliminal messaging on the upcoming referendum on legalizing divorce. Also, the military junta in Greece were allowed to enter the contest for the first time, but members in the band that they planned to send, Nostradamus, had been accused of raping a 16-year-old. Because the father dropped the charges for money, some began to question the case, and some also speculate it could have been the junta who looked to undermine this new band and their non-traditional music, as they quickly banned their music from being broadcast on radio stations. Or it could well have just happened. Then there was Paulo de Carvalho, the Portuguese entrance. He sang E Depois do Adeus, and when that was broadcast at 10:55 PM, it sparked a revolution, ending decades of dictatorship in that country. So there had been a dictatorship in Portugal since the early 20th century. This began with a coup in 1926, which ended the unstable First Republic. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar would eventually come to power, and he forged the Estado Novo, or New State. This was a style of corporatist dictatorship, but trying to pin down the actual beliefs is quite hard. For now, let's just say it followed Catholic social doctrine and was ardently opposed to communism, so more similar to Mussolini's fascism rather than Hitler's National Socialism. And Salazar would lead Portugal through the Second World War, and for that matter the Spanish Civil War. During both of these he would remain neutral, however he was a quiet supporter of the fascist powers, like Franco and Hitler. This neutrality allowed him to remain in power after the war, and he was a good anti-communist ally for the Western powers during the Cold War. But it should be said that during his time in power, Portugal experienced considerable economic growth, so he continued to have a great deal of support. But Salazar had a stroke in 1968, and Marcelo Caetano took over, but he inherited a major problem, the colonial wars. Whereas the other European nations had by this time largely given up their colonies in Africa, Portugal clung on to theirs. They had taken on the idea of Lusotropicalism, which in short was the belief that they were more of a humane colonizer than their European counterparts, and favoured multiculturalism. Plus they also had the concept of pluricontinentalism. This was the idea that Portugal wasn't even an empire at all, but rather a transcontinental nation. So Salazar had been adamant that the empire, or the large Portuguese nation, should remain intact. He even refused to allow Goa to unite with the newly independent Indian nation, and even when the Indians forcibly took it in 1961, Goa continued to have a seat in the Portuguese National Assembly. The Indians, by the way, were able to do so because Angolans had risen up and troops were sent from India to deal with this uprising. Rebellions in Mozambique and modern-day Guinea-Bissau followed, and the Portuguese army was unprepared for such wars. More and more of their budget was being spent on these conflicts, and they began to face backlash on the international stage. Obviously, holding on to colonies by then was unpopular, and public opinion abroad was largely against the Portuguese. Plus, by fighting these wars, they angered the Western powers, and to some extent were aiding their old enemies, the communists. After all, the Soviets were keen to move in and fund the rebels, and the longer the war persisted, the stronger the communists in the Portuguese colonies became. The Americans were aware of this and pressured the Portuguese to leave, but Portugal, increasingly isolated from the world, did not. Even after some sanctions and embargoes were put in place, the Portuguese persisted. At home, as public opinion turned against the wars and the government, the Portuguese secret police, the PIDE, stepped up their crackdowns and repression. Caetano did introduce some reforms like allowing trade unions to form after decades of being banned, but the situation continued to grow worse. For instance, the army constantly needed more men to fight out in Africa, and conscription was introduced. This, along with the repression carried out by the secret police, forced many Portuguese to flee the country. It is estimated that 1 million or so went to France, 1 million went to America, and more elsewhere. Plus, keep in mind, Portugal only has a population of like 10 million today, and in the 1960s and 70s, you can see a drop in the population caused by people fleeing. By 1974, the Portuguese had around 170 soldiers, but only around 35,000 of these were actually in Portugal. The rest of them obviously were fighting out in the colonies. And to deal with the need for more soldiers, men of lower classes were raised to the rank of officer. Many of these young officers and enlisted men were more inclined to oppose the wars, and some even sympathised with the rebels. And from these young officers you had the formation of the MFA, the Movement of the Armed Forces. They looked to bring about change and hopefully democracy, and they were encouraged by the publication of a book, Portugal and the Future, which advocated for a peaceful solution to the conflicts and potentially the formation of a Portuguese Commonwealth. It was also written by General Antonio de Spinola, who had led Portuguese soldiers in Guinea-Bissau and gained a great deal of admiration from his men. Meanwhile, the leaders of the MFA, men like Vasco Gonçalves and Salgueiro Maia, began to meet with other officers and plot to overthrow the government. These meetings, however, weren't held in some underground bunker or in some secret location in the woods. Instead, many of them were held at picnics. Just outside of barracks, they would host these picnics for the other officers and their wives, and there they recruited more and more men. This seems like the most adorable way to plan a revolution, and it was during these adorable meetings that they decided the most adorable way to start the revolution. Wait until the Eurovision song was broadcast. This was the signal to all of the plotters to begin to synchronize their actions, and they waited another couple of hours until another song was played. This song was Grandola Vila Morena, and after this song was broadcast around midnight, the rebels began to move. Many of the soldiers agreed to voluntarily follow their officers, and throughout the night they moved to take the airport radio stations and the likes. As they encountered other soldiers, they just joined in the rebellion. But this was almost a bloodless revolution. Only around 4 people died during the whole thing, when the secret police fired upon a crowd. Other than that, no real fighting took place, and soldiers put flowers in their rifles to show their peaceful intentions. And these flowers gave the name to the revolution, the Carnation Revolution. The next day the government had left power, and the old fascist-like organisations were dismantled, these being the secret police, Portuguese Youth and Portuguese Legion. And I know that many people may argue with the fact that I called them a fascist-like organisation, but the Legion, for instance, used to give the fascist salute, and as a paramilitary unit they were sort of sworn to defend the Christian heritage of Portugal and fight against the communist threat. So it's hard to argue that they were at least a little bit fascist. The Portuguese colonies out in Africa were also given their independence pretty quickly, and Spinola was put in charge of the new junta. Now this junta ruled for around a year and oversaw the country's transition over to democracy. There were, however, fierce disputes between the new leaders, and Spinola in particular was worried about the far left elements within power now. But ultimately, the country did transition to democracy, and the Third Republic came into being. Yet despite this being a relatively recent revolution, it seems that many in Portugal look back fondly to the old days and Estado Novo. For instance, in 2007, a TV programme did a poll on the 100 greatest Portuguese of all time, and the winner wasn't some famous explorer or king, it was Salazar. During the final polls, when only 10 people remained, he still got over 40% of the vote. People like Henry the Navigator only got 2% of the vote, and Vasco da Gama got 0.7%. Yet, interestingly, the Portuguese man who came in second was Álvaro Cunhal, the leader of the Communist Party during this period. So it looks like Portugal is still divided on the issue, and, as I said before, I can expect a great number of people on both sides calling me biased. Anyway, here is how the Eurovision Song Contest helped in launching a revolution. And my question to you is, can you think of another song which potentially changed the world, or was involved in wars? One example comes to my mind was not necessarily a specific song, but I know that during the US invasion of Panama, the Americans played songs on loudspeakers to force the president to resign. From what I gather, it seems that they played a lot of songs that taunted the president, like I Fought the Law. Here the troops were obviously mocking President Noriega, after all he was involved in the drug trade. Others were songs like Welcome to the Jungle and All I Want Is You by U2, so obviously a little bit ironic. Now, what are your choices for songs being involved in world history, either used in war or potentially changing the course of humanity? Leave it in the comments below.